There came a knock upon his door, quite a loud knock, and he started forward in his low chair and sat listening, with his right hand almost on the floor. "That'll be Olympia. If she's seen Flossie going—" The knocking was repeated more determinedly, and he called, "Come in," because he imagined that Olympia would not really care to come into his room. Mrs. Kerr Howe came in. She was in a purple Japanese kimono, with a swallow worked in gold thread over each breast, and a great roll and bow at her back, her maid having learned how to put kimonos on in Tokyo. She tripped in, and her smallness gave a certain Japanese air of littleness, resignation, and obedience, and remarked, "I said we must have an explanation before tomorrow morning. I've come for it." And she sat herself down on the edge of the armchair facing the Major's and looked at him. The contrast between her appearance and her mental attitude always surprised the Major so much. He was always expecting some sort of soft fluffiness to come out somewhere, that he simply gave up the situation. He let drop any attempt to understand and to control it with the words, "I'm simply too flabbergasted to be able to try to explain anything. I couldn't explain the theory of lateral strains in bridges. And there seem to be 10 or a dozen women determined to go after me here. I never knew such a place. It's like being mad." And suddenly he really felt a sort of glad madness. He couldn't imagine that he was not at least going to get some fun out of it. Mrs. Kerr Howe said, "Well, I'm glad you feel some remorse." "Oh, it's not exactly remorse," he answered almost gaily. "It's like having indigestion very badly, so that you can't eat, with 10 dishes that you'd like to eat very much just under your poor nose." Mrs. Kerr Howe said contemptuously, "I suppose you think that I am one of the 10 or a dozen. It's like you to regard yourself as the Grand Turk." "It's like you, Juliana," the Major said, "to say polygamous things of that sort. I wish I just felt like that." "No doubt you do," Mrs. Kerr Howe said, with an even deeper note of determination, "but I'm going to have my explanation. There was not time in the train because I wanted to get my play settled about, and from what I've seen of Miss Peabody, your aunt introduced me to her as your oldest, best, and most affectionate friend, so she's prepared for what's coming. From what I've seen of the lady, I don't imagine she will leave us much time together tomorrow, so it has got to be now." "But, my dear Juliana," the Major said, "I'm a reformed character." "I don't in the least understand you," Mrs. Kerr Howe said. "I haven't asked you to do anything but your simple duty." "It's really all I can do to understand myself," the Major laughed. "I can only tell you that I vowed to reform the moment I crossed my aunt's threshold. I'm bound to say that, from what I can make of it, she does not seem anxious that I should. But still, that's my job. A difficult one, but I'm doing my best." Mrs. Kerr Howe pointed to Miss Delamere's slippers that were on the fender. "You've been having someone to help you," she said amiably. But the Major had noticed her eye on them by the speech before the last. "Oh, those?" he said. "That's a little present I brought for poor Olympia. She's so liable to cold that I was airing them a little, but I do wish you'd go." And then Mrs. Kerr Howe remarked, "Poor fellow." The Major started energetically forward in his chair. "Look here," he shouted, "don't you say that. I can stand anything but that. There's nothing the matter with me. I don't want pity." Mrs. Kerr Howe was looking down upon the fender with what she meant to be an expression of meditative cruelty. "Do you always give people second-hand hearts and presents?" she asked. "These slippers have been worn, I see." "Why, of course, Juliana," the Major answered with an engaging air of candor. "I always have presents worn when I bring them to the ball. It saves the customs duty." "I see," she said slowly, as if she were working out. "You get Flossie Delamere to wear them before you present them to your fiancé. That's what's called standing in another woman's shoes, isn't it? And to save you the trouble of lying in it. I know Olympia why she left this room and had enough decency not to want to be seen. She did not seem to mind." "Mind? Why should she? She's got a good conscience and a heart of gold." my dear Juliana, you are astonishingly off the track here. It won't wash. It really won't wash. When I said on the train that little Flossie was a sort of half-sister of mine, you thought I was lying. But I wasn't. I wasn't, really. It's only what's called intelligent anticipation. You see, my aunt was in his room a short time ago saying that she meant to adopt Flossie because she is a dear little thing. And then she went off and talked to Flossie, so of course Flossie was naturally excited about it and wanted to talk to me. And if you don't believe that, you'd better go and ask my aunt if it isn't true. That's what you ought to have understood when I said a sort of half-sister. It is only the president of a society like yours that could put an evil construction on the words. Oh, I have no doubt, you can get your aunt to turn to a tale with you. You're capable of anything in the persuasion line, and I have no doubt Miss What about your reputation, the Major asked? What about your reputation if you should be discovered here? Mrs. Kerr held her shut. Oh, I know you can take her mind, she said. But look here, we live in the 20th century, and a woman can perfectly be alone with a man without losing her reputation. You can tell that to my aunt, the Major said. So I have, Mrs. Kerr Howe asserted, and she entirely agrees with me that censoriousness is the worst of the vices. Oh, well, the Major said, you just tell her tomorrow morning that you came to my room at 12:15 at night, and you'll see the fur fly. You aren't going to be her adopted daughter. Oh, you aren't going to get out of it in that way, Mrs. Kerr Howe said calmly. I've come here as one man might to another, to ask you what you mean to do. Well, I'll tell you what I jolly well mean to do, he answered. I'm engaged to Miss Olympia Peabody of Boston, Massachusetts, and I mean to be as faithful to her as I can. I used to think that it would be as easy as eating eggs to be a reformed character under the virtuous roof of my aunt and uncle, but it's more like the temptation of St. Anthony. I couldn't have imagined that British middle-class families could be this sort of thing. They evidently are, but I never knew anything like it. It was at this point that Mrs. Kerr Howe said softly, with a glance on the ground, "Aren't you going to kiss me, Teddy?" And the Major remarked, with the air of one bathed in monotony, "No, I'm shot if I am." "Don't you," Mrs. Kerr Howe said, "don't you remember Simla?" "Oh, you are too late at the fair," the Major said. "I don't remember Simla. I don't in the least want to remember Simla. The last time I was there was just after some Abor gentleman had shot a rotten little stone-headed arrow into my thigh, and the silly little stone head came off, and the bone sawyers had no end of a job in getting bits of it out for months after I got back to the residency. No, I don't in the least want to remember Simla." "I ought to have been there to nurse you," Mrs. Kerr Howe said. "You ought to have been nursing your husband," the Major said grimly. "I had an R.C. sister." And again Mrs. Kerr Howe dropped her voice. "Don't you want to marry me, Teddy?" "Well," the Major said levelly, "speaking as man to man, I don't. I want to marry Olympia. That is to say, I don't want to. I've got to. I'm bound in honor, and that's an end of it." "But at Simla, you said—" Mrs. Kerr Howe was beginning, but the Major interrupted her in a businesslike voice. "I never said a single word about marrying you at Simla. I remember every blessed word I did say. How could I have talked about marrying you? You had a husband, and you weren't a bit more in earnest than I was. You were just flirting with a subaltern to pass the time, and to get conversation to put in your books. Why, you were 10 years older than I was then. Of course, you're younger now, but there is someone else on the scene. I'm very sorry. You're too late. You said I was to talk to you as a man, so there, you've got it. I don't want—" But he was interrupted in his turn by Mrs. Kerr Howe, who exclaimed, "Why, where did that horrible little dog come from?" And indeed, a very small Pekingese spaniel, like a piece of glossy brown hearth-rug, was sitting beside the Major's chair, and gazing up with adoration at one of his hands that hung over the side. The Major sprang up sharply just in time to see the little animal, that knew his habits very well, crawl under the very low bed. He sprang after it, but it had already disappeared, and he was quite unable to move the bed, which, with its great carved pillars and heavy walnut canopy, weighed nearly 1/2 ton. "Great heavens!" the Major exclaimed. "We're lost. I'm lost. You're lost. I knew it would come. Why in the world did you leave the door open? If I could have caught the little beast, I might have chucked him outside and thrown boots and things at him till he went back to his mistress. As it is, there's no hope." Mrs. Kerr Howe drew herself up with an expression approaching as near as possible to one of severe virtue. "Do you suppose," she said, "that I was going to be alone with a man at night with a door shut?" "Well, it's usual to shut the door on these occasions," the Major said. Mrs. Kerr Howe remarked, "I don't know what sort of women you can be used to." But the remark failed considerably of its effect, because the Major was upon his stomach trying to get under the bed, which was much too low for him. He leaned upon one elbow and glared fiercely at Mrs. Kerr Howe. Mrs. Kerr Howe laughed. "I don't see what it matters," she said. But the Major waved at her the arm that he was not leaning on and said violently, "What it matters is that I shall lose Olympia. She'll be here in a minute. I'll bet my head she will. There's a sort of psychic affinity between her and that little beast under the bed. She says she wakes up in the night and feels cold if it isn't lying on her doormat. I tell you, I shall lose Olympia." "Well, I don't care," Mrs. Kerr Howe said. "And if you're found here," the Major continued, "they'll say you're compromised and I shall have to marry you." "Well, I don't care," Mrs. Kerr Howe repeated. "But I tell you this too, Juliana," the Major said seriously. "If you're compromised, my uncle certainly won't let Flossie Delamere produce your old play. That's what it will come to." Mrs. Kerr Howe suddenly started to her feet. "Not produce my play!" she exclaimed. "But that's infamous!" "That's what will happen," the Major repeated. "You ought to have thought of that before you came. My uncle is absolutely devoted to Olympia." "I've never heard of such a thing," Mrs. Kerr Howe said. "I'm going at once." "That's your beastly artistic pride," the Major commented. "You'd rather have a play produced than even a husband like me. But you're not going down that staircase when there's a 20-to-1 chance that Olympia's coming up it. Listen, listen!" He held up one finger. There couldn't be any doubt that someone was coming up the stairs, which were of uncarpeted and polished black oak. "Not another word," the Major whispered. "I'll do my best." And lying upon his stomach, the Major began to emit, in a series of melancholy yelps, the name George. For in a moment of jocular humor, the Major had christened his present to Miss Peabody, George Washington. And at the necessary point he called out sharply, "Who's there?" An American voice with a highly cultured English accent answered, "It is I, Olympia." "Oh, well," the Major said, "the father of his country is under my bed, and I'm doing my best to get under my bed. So there, in a manner of speaking, we all are." He was aware that Mrs. Kerr Howe, behind the great bed curtains, was pressing as close to the wall as she reasonably could. "I woke up," Miss Peabody's voice said. "I was awakened by feeling in my bones that George was not in his basket on the mat outside my door. I was convinced that he would be here. May I come in?" The Major was getting up onto his knees. "That you certainly may not." "But why not?" the voice came from the door. "I can see through the crack that you are fully dressed. I'm coming in." The Major stormed as fast as he could toward the door, but Miss Peabody was already in front of the fireplace. "What a fine room you've got," she said. "It's so ancestral, so distinguished. Don't you think we could induce Lady Seville to sell it to us for our home?" The Major said, and he really was furiously angry, "Now this really won't do. You must get out of my room at once. It's unheard of at this time of night. We've never done anything like this before." And he put her on the fire and the room's very dark, since the only light it contained was that of the candle that Miss Delamere had left. Olympia said, "It's ridiculous of you, Teddy. It's not as if I was some flighty young girl or one of your dissolute companions that I hope you've given up for good. I suppose I can be trusted." "No, you can't," the Major said. "No one can be trusted at this time of night, and in this latitude." "You don't seem at all glad to see me," Miss Peabody said. "Aren't you going to kiss me?" The Major said, "Oh, damn." And then he added, "Look here, Olympia. I'll kiss you with pleasure once you're outside my room. You don't understand. You can't possibly understand. This isn't Boston. I can't have things said against my wife. Anyone may be coming in." "You don't seem quite master of yourself tonight," Olympia said. "I hope you haven't been taking that nasty champagne again. Who would be likely to come in at this hour?" "Anybody might," the Major answered. "It's the custom of the country. Besides, it's the principle of the thing that I object to. It isn't right. It isn't proper." And suddenly his face really paled beneath its tan, and his attitude of appalled listening was so intense that even Miss Olympia was silent. From far away he had heard a voice wailing, "Teddy! I say, Teddy, I can't find my room." It was only the trained voice of an actress that could have carried so far, and have made the words so distinct. "What's that?" Olympia exclaimed. "I don't know," the Major said desperately. "It's an echo. It's a ghost. You never know what goes on in these old houses." At first he thought of pushing Miss Peabody out of the room, and then he thought of running to the door to keep the other woman out. But if he did that, he was perfectly certain that Olympia would go to examine the panel and see Mrs. Kerr Howe, who was hiding behind the curtain. If it had only been the purple kimono, she would have been invisible in the shadows, but the golden embroidered swallows upon the lady's breast he had observed already to gleam like brass plates. And then Miss Delamere, who had evidently been coming very fast, ran into the room and exclaimed breathlessly, "I say, Teddy, I can't find my room. I've been walking for miles and I can't find it. I shall have to stop here all—" And then she stopped suddenly with the exclamation, "Oh, I didn't know you'd got company. I'm sure I beg your pardon." End of Part 1, Chapter 6.